As we all know, a very, very timely and important topic. I think since this morning there are two words we keep hearing: diplomacy and localization. So we'll do our best in the next 1 hour and 15 minutes to have a very engaging conversation. I'm Joëlle Germanier. I'm the Executive Director of the Center of Competence on Humanitarian Negotiation. It's an ECHO partner, a collaborative platform based in Geneva that works with many international local organizations to basically provide fundamental negotiation and diplomatic skills to our colleagues and teams on the ground who are trying their best to respond to today's challenging environment. Ladies and gentlemen, as we speak, civilians, women, children, and humanitarian staff are being killed, all the way from Gaza to Ukraine to Sudan to Haiti, Myanmar, and the list goes on. As today we know there are over 120 active conflicts. So what do we hear from our colleagues on the ground? This is the question. What do we hear from those humanitarian negotiators who are trying on a daily basis to get access to protect civilians, to protect their staff? Well, we know, we've heard them. They are really witnessing increasing challenges in terms of access denial, their own safety, the disregard of international norms, the lack of acceptance or even sometimes understanding of those fundamental humanitarian values that we talk so much about. Well, they are facing the reality of what it means to trying to put those values, those norms in practice on a daily basis, and they are struggling. Hence, we're here today. They very much need, as humanitarian, the political support of states. And this is the conversation we will be looking at together. So how, in this very challenging period that is testing basically our humanity, our leadership, and our collective will to uphold those values and those principles, how in this context is humanitarian diplomacy still a relevant tool at our disposal, and how best can we use it as humanitarians, as states, and as communities. So this is what we will be looking at with this distinguished panel. But before I introduce them, I want to say two things. One is you will be able, of course, to engage our online colleagues and the audience here in the room through Slido. So the QR code will be appearing a few times while the conversation is going on. And the second thing, we want also very much to kick off the conversation by listening to a leader, a youth leader, Asma, from Somalia, who will share what she is going through with her community when it comes to the conflict in Mogadishu, Somalia. So let's listen to Asma.
magacaygu waa Asma, da'daydu waa 17 sano. Markayna hore waxaan ka soo qaxnay Muqdisho. Waxaan uga soo qaxnay Muqdisho maadaama ay colaadi ka jirtay yaani la'aan. Halkaasina oo qaraabadayda qayb ka mid ah nooga baaba'day. Saa darteed dantu waxay nabaday inaan ka soo qaxno oo xaggaan soo aadno. maadaama meesha dagaal ka jiray waxbarashadayadii ayaa istaagtay oo waxaan mugdi galay mustaqbalkeedii. sidoo kale markaan kasoo qaxnay Muqdisho saaxiibadayda yaraanta ayaa meesha ku waayay. xilliyadaas qaraxyadu jireen way ku adkeyd qoyskayga inay helaan maalmeedkeena. wax gargaar aan ma soo gaari jirin sababo amni darro darteed. haddaan nahay caruur waxaan xaq u leenahay inaan helno ammaan, waxbarasho iyo fursada ugu noolaano cabsi la'aan. nabad ayaa u baahanahay. dhammaan hogaamiyayaasha iyo deeq-bixiyayaasha alle waxaan ugu yeerinaan xasuusta. fadlan idinku awoodiina adeegsanaya hubiya inuu gargaarka gaaro caruurta. sidoo kale nagu caawiya inuu gargaarku inuu helo dhabo uu nagu soo gaaro.
Thank you to ECHO and World Vision for this powerful. So how do we bring the voices of communities on the table of humanitarian diplomacy approaches? And I want now to start with our distinguished panel here. I will start with Ramesh Rajasinghe. He is the head of OCHA in Geneva and also the director of Coordination Division. Of course, Ramesh, you have more than 25 years of experience in the UN, including as OCHA acting under Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator and acting Assistant Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Deputy Emergency Relief Coordinator. I think we've heard this morning also from Tom Fletcher, right, the importance of the humanitarian reset, the UN reform. But in light of all this challenging situation happening, what do you anticipate will be the consequences for communities on the ground? And also in light of that, what does it mean for our humanitarian diplomacy approach?
Thanks very much, John. And it's a great pleasure to be here on this panel. And I think, just as you mentioned, it would be wonderful to have Asma sitting here as well to tell us what we should be doing. I think just in response to your very good question, even before all this happened in the last few months, last year we faced the biggest funding gap that we had ever faced in the human community. We had asked for about almost $50 billion. We received just under 40% of that. So, and that was not necessarily a loss in generosity. It was, we were getting more funding from donors. It's just that the problem was getting much, much bigger, and it was accumulating with no solution. So the drastic funding cuts have now just been exacerbated by the attacks on multilateralism and multilateral institutions, the politicization of aid, which has pushed us all to the breaking point as we have seen over the last few months. And as I mentioned, we are now looking at 200 million people who live under the control of non-state armed group territories. We're looking at 200 million people who are in need of humanitarian assistance, and we'll have to reprioritize that number to drastically cut it down, just so that we'll be able to focus on the fewer, smaller number that we have the resources to address. So it's not just a resource gap. For us, it's a legitimacy and a relevance crisis. If we cannot deliver at scale or uphold the principles that we espouse, we risk being sidelined in this financial squeeze. And as a result, humanitarian diplomacy has an even bigger role to play in this, to help catalyze more sustainable, locally driven responses, including by advocating, obviously, for unimpeded access. And my boss, Tom Fletcher, I think, reflected this in his comments as well today. And it's quite clear, we're not going to get the funding we need, and we're not going to go back to where we were last year, for example. And even if we were, we would still see a growing problem, because as I mentioned before, the needs are outgrowing whatever funding we can get, even before this recent crisis. So we need solutions, and the humanitarians are not necessarily the ones to bring those solutions. We've often seen that when we are in an operation, often no one else wants to come in because they feel humanitarians can keep the pot from boiling over and can manage the crisis. But it's not managing crisis, because no humanitarian crisis can be managed with relief assistance alone. So in the face of all these challenges, there's a growing need to strengthen relationships with political partners. Now, often this has been an allergic reaction from humanitarian actors. We have to, in this case, though, have a close relationship with political partners, mainly to bring them into that arena, to see where they can influence the actors, to help resolve the situation, to roll back vulnerability, and to also help us achieve our goals, which is to exit the situation, so the populations can support themselves, the governments can support them as well. So our humanitarian diplomacy must be much more cooperative, better coordinated, and should benefit from broadened political networks of influence. And this is where we would look to the EU, because you do have very special relationships with a lot of these actors in terms of member states, and how do you bring to bear your soft powers to be able to help us do this. ONCHA and the UN can help leverage our mandate as a UN actor, and then also act as a new convener, using humanitarian diplomacy to bring together. But we can only remain neutral if principles are equally applied, and they're not selectively picked by everyone. So maybe I'll end here, Jean, pass it back to you. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Ramesh. So we've heard you, a very strong call for close relationship and collaboration between humanitarian and political actors, and at the same time, I think already a concrete call for the EU to also very much use even more the soft power. Now I want to turn to you, Jan Egeland, who has been the Secretary General of the Norwegian Refugee Council for more than a decade now, leading humanitarian operations with over 15,000 relief workers in 40 countries, serving nearly 10 million people in need. You also have a past, of course, in mediation and peace processes. You've served also as a State Secretary in the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, where you've been working on the Oslo Agreement. So here, Jan, of course, you represent also the voice of the NGO on this very important panel, and with the very deep operational footprint that NRC has in all those difficult humanitarian crises. How can you help us describe how humanitarian diplomacy efforts really materialize on the ground? And would you say we are failing the people today, Jan?
Yeah, I would say we fail too many, in part because we lack the resources, which is the big talk of, I think, of the Humanitarian Forum, is the deep budget cuts. But we also fail enormous communities because we're not there in their hour of greatest need, because we're blocked, because we're denied access, because our relief is denied access, because we're militarized, instrumentalized by governments and by parties to armed conflict. This has been a problem for 100 years, more. And for all of these generations of humanitarian work, we have tried to become more and more effective and efficient in delivering assistance. And we've reached enormous goalposts. I remember when Deir ez-Zor was besieged in eastern Syria, it was possible for the first time to do airdrops from I don't know how many thousands of meters up, and it became 95% hit and so on. You know, perfection in terms of delivery. And now we're basically denied access to an equally besieged population, which is Gaza. Not because it's difficult to get. It's the easiest place on earth to roll into. It's deliberate starvation that is happening in Gaza. If there was a deliberate attempt to avoid us to be in Samsam camp, some courageous colleagues were there, but we were not collectively in Samsam when the massacres took place in western Sudan, in northern Darfur. So I'm glad it's on the agenda here now, because this age-old imperative for humanitarians to demand, negotiate, make access to the people in their hour of greatest need has not made the same commensurate progress. I mean, 2025, and we're denied access in one place after the other. It's an outrage that is not echoed enough in capital cities and among decision makers. So I also think, I mean, my own organization has tried now for 12 years to really systematically try to get to hard-to-reach places. Sometimes we succeed, sometimes we have not. We were able to be on all sides of the front lines in Syria. We're not even in the Russian-occupied areas of Ukraine, and we have not got one truck to Gaza the last 2 months, really. So yes, we fail, and I think we should be much blunter in saying who are denying us access, who's supporting those who deny access, who give the arms to that, and call people out, because it's an outrage that this still happens in 2025.
Thank you very much, Jan, for really bringing the reality of what we are facing on the ground and how we are collectively failing and the need to shift and step up and speak up. And now I want to actually move to the perspective also from our colleague Mathieu Kimmel. So he's the Director for Humanitarian Policy at Global Affairs Canada, where you are overseeing basically partnership with the UN, the Red Cross and NGOs, and coordinating efforts to advance the protection of civilians in armed conflict. He also has a long career as foreign service officer with assignment in Asia, in Africa. So now let's also, when it comes to HD, we've heard it, it's how we're also very much collaborating between efforts on humanitarian organization on the ground and the support and the political will of states to come in. So Canada, of course, has been playing a very important role when it comes to humanitarian diplomacy. We've also been strongly advocating about the role of donors to actually enable partners themselves to do humanitarian diplomacy. So can you speak us a bit on that, what concretely in action it means, why it really matters, and where you see also the key parameters for it to be successful?
Thank you very much, Joanne, and thank you very much for having me today. It's quite the panel to be on, and the topic could not be more timely or important. I think we've heard all morning how the needs have increased dramatically and how the space has decreased to address them. And the ones who are paying the price for this, of course, are civilians, are the populations that we are all collectively trying to serve. And there is undoubtedly an urgency, an imperative for all of us to act and to do more to uphold, international humanitarian law and the norms that we've established to protect civilians around the world. And, Canada, just like many others in this room, has been quite vocal on this, and we will continue to be, and we will be consistent in our calls for IHL, and we will engage in humanitarian diplomacy in a forceful way to protect the space for actors to work. But to your point, Joanne, we also have a role as humanitarian donors. We have a role to enable the activities of partners who are doing this on the ground on a daily, whether it's the UN or the NGOs or the Red Cross, international actors, but also, of course, local actors. They are, putting their neutrality and their impartiality up front as a means to really access the populations, and we, as donors, have to support them in that role. Whether it's, their action is local, but it's also global. I'm sure Jan has briefed the Security Council, and others around this table have briefed the Security Council on countless occasions. Our partners are negotiating deconfliction mechanisms with parties to conflict. They're training armed forces on IHL, but they're also on a day-to-day basis negotiating at that checkpoint to let the truck in so that the goods can reach the people in need. As donors, we have to enable them. So I think the first step for us to do that is recognize that while humanitarian crises and solutions to humanitarian crises are inherently political, humanitarian donorship should not be. Humanitarian donorship, we have to be principled in our approach. We as donors are not principled actors. We are not neutral or impartial actors, but as donors, we have to support actors who are, and we have to do so in a principled way. It starts with flexible and predictable funding, of course, as we've heard here and this year and in the past. It's critical for our partners to have the flexibility to be able to adapt and to change to very quickly evolving access realities. And they have to be able to pivot their operations quickly. They have to be able to get to the people in need. And that, from a donorship perspective, takes effort to separate our impartial donorship, our impartial allocations to crises from our political imperatives, and that takes internal effort to make sure that we are separating our objectives, and we can approach humanitarian donorship from that more neutral lens. There's also a space for us to dedicate funding to actors who are working in that humanitarian and peace nexus space. To those actors that are in there for the long term, who are building relationships with parties to conflict, with stakeholders, with society, with communities, and who are doing that through active and long-standing negotiation and mediation. So partners like the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, or Civic, or Geneva Call, to name a few that are out there and doing this in the long term. We have a need to support those kind of targeted investments. We also have to make sure that we don't constrain the ability of our partners to act. Whether it's our sanctions regime have to have clear carve-outs for humanitarian actions. We can't make populations pay for the actions of those we're targeting. And similarly with the counterterrorism legislation that all of us, that our respective countries have in place, we have to make sure that we create the space to be able to fund actors that can act without fear of prosecution. And then finally, I think to the more, the diplomatic piece of it all, I do think we have a role to play in using our diplomatic channels effectively to defend the space when it's needed. And that can be in, behind the scenes, it can be through our embassies, it can be in our diplomatic engagement or publicly and vocally. But I think it always has to be in consultation with those who are on the ground working to make sure that they're not or unintentionally hindering their efforts. And it has to be with a view to being able to reach as many of the people we are all collectively trying to serve. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthew, for providing us with very concrete examples on also the role states play as a humanitarian donor to enable our operations on the ground, but also very much the last point on, how are you using also your diplomatic channel to support humanitarian outcomes. And I think this leads us very nicely to our last but not least panelist, Barry Andrews, who is an Irish member of the European Parliament representing the Dublin constituency since 2020, a member also of the Fianna Fáil party, who aligns with the Renew Europe grouping within the European Parliament, and beside his impressive political career, he has also been leading for some time an international development NGO. So, Barry, please, as a member of the European Parliament, can you help us a bit unpack some of the current, challenges and opportunities that are happening within Parliament when everybody is kind of expecting the EU to take on more of a leadership role when it comes to humanitarian diplomacy issues?
Yeah, thank you very much, Joelle. And we are challenging the Commission to make a clear statement based on the US withdrawal, but we haven't had that yet. So we will continue to press the Commission to show the leadership that's necessary here, because the silence is deafening, frankly, and I know that President von der Leyen committed to not reducing humanitarian aid this morning in her video message, and that's very welcome, but humanitarian aid is not a solution to conflict. It's not a solution to any of the problems that humanitarian aid seeks to address. So it will be incredibly short-sighted if we completely turn our back on the other parts of the equation that are necessary. So my committee is working on the next budget from 2028 to 2035, and we're very worried about a merger of the humanitarian instrument with the development instrument. This is something that runs the danger of politicizing and instrumentalizing humanitarian aid. So it's great that there's a base. That's what President von der Leyen is going to do. But we have to make sure that the idea of impartiality and independence is protected in the architecture of the budget. So we're working very hard on that. We're also recognize we really play a very important advocacy role in this space now, because I feel a lot of those who would normally speak up are a little bit afraid to speak up in the current situation for fear of retribution. You definitely not been one of them, Jan. You're always so articulate and clear in what you say. But there is a gap, I feel, and we have to step into that. And one of the things that we consistently have to say is that it is very hard for the European Union to persuade anybody that we are entitled to credibility in this space, when on one hand we are delighted to see ICJ interventions in the Russia-Ukraine war. We're delighted to see ICC arrest warrants for Putin and various other members of the Russian regime. But when the same happens in Gaza, it is met with silence. And rather than supporting humanitarian diplomacy or international humanitarian law, we are encouraging impunity. And it is a completely...
Thank you very much, Barry, for really striking two essential points, right, on really that we cannot go towards the politicization of humanitarian aid funding, and the second one, as you say, in the end, there is an advocacy gap, but who has the credibility to advocate on behalf of communities in need when we are facing double standards? So let's continue the round here, and I think now we want to really, we've heard, I think it really helped us set the state of humanitarian diplomacy from a humanitarian and state perspective. Now let's go more towards, what do we want to change? What are recommendations? We are sitting here in Brussels, one of the biggest, probably the biggest humanitarian conference currently happening in the world. We have many leaders in the room. Jan, I will start with you. What are your recommendations, please, for, of course, the EU when it comes to humanitarian diplomacy?
What needs to be done?
Yes.
Number one, we need leadership. So one of my messages now I come from a country outside of the European Union, unfortunately, but I dare come with recommendations. I think it would be a strategic mistake of the European Union to not step up when the United States have relinquished all humanitarian leadership. And there is a need for a convener now. European Union can convene us on themes like how sanctions, you mentioned that from Canada. Sanctions is one of the problems we have in terms of access or presence in many places. European Union help on the theme, help also on country cases. I mentioned Sudan, I mentioned Gaza, Myanmar, etc. Bring other parties, actors to the table. I believe Qatar was supposed to sit on the panel. It would have been very interesting. They can play a role. We're humanitarians. We work with anyone to reach the people who are the victims in the depths of hell. You have to speak to the devil, but you also have to speak to those who can speak to the devil so that we can open up and get access to the people who are suffering. United Nations need to play this leadership role, and it often is. I mean, yes, Fletcher is now doing his utmost. Many of his humanitarian coordinators do not have the guts to really challenge the host government, the parties to the conflict, and so on. A humanitarian coordinator should show leadership, guts, and should be promoted if they are PNG'd out of the play. They cannot be sent to Siberia, they should be sent to Brussels. And then, of course, we as NGOs also have a big job to do. We need to have people who can do negotiations, who can do outreach, who speak the languages, who can connect. Working with local organizations, local actors, from Kandahar to the rebel-held area of Myanmar to the jungles of Colombia and elsewhere. We need to be there. And at times I find us, in a way, say, yeah, we need another seminar about how bad it is to be for the abused women of Eastern Congo. They don't need another side event in Geneva. They need presence in their villages and access to their places. We need to be there, really. We need to negotiate with M23 and all of it. We need to give priority to field operations. Then we will make progress. At the moment, we have a bit of standstill. And then, since it is also very important these days, I agree very much with Barry that the lack of coherence when Western powers only criticize their enemies and not strong with their friends is really a big problem for us. And the credibility is lost now for the West in eastern Ukraine and elsewhere, when they are providing the bombs that are pummeling Gaza, but not demanding access.
Thank you, Jan. I think you really provided a very strong set of recommendations, as much, I think, for us as humanitarians, and I can only very much support what you're saying as a center of competence on humanitarian negotiation. the need to talk to all sides and be there on the ground and engage with everyone, which has always been the role of humanitarian workers, but that with the shrinking space is starting to be more limited. And then a very strong call again of leadership in action from state to help us also bring the right actors around the table and not just like-minded actors, like we like to call them. Thank you very much. So let me now turn to Matthew. And as we are talking about, leadership of the European Union, but also with Canada's current presidency of the G7, do you see here an opportunity on how we could also leverage the G7 more when it comes to humanitarian diplomacy?
Merci, Jude. So I think, Canada took over the presidency of the G7 this year in January, and I think it's an understatement to say that it was a period of crisis and change, both on the global stage with the multiplication of the crises that as an international community we were trying to focus on, but also within the G7 itself. There's been, I think it's 4 changes of leadership across the G7 since we took over the presidency. I think it's 5 if you count Japan a month earlier. So there's been a lot of change within the G7 as well, including in the US and in Canada. In Canada, we've had our own electoral process just recently. But I think throughout that change, the G7 has remained quite committed and a steady voice on the protection of civilians and international humanitarian law, and on humanitarian access in particular. This year alone has taken firm and concrete positions on access in Sudan, calling on for an end to support the N23. It's taken positions on access and humanitarian and the humanitarian situation in the DRC. Sorry, the DRC is where I was referring to N23 about Sudan. But suffice it to say, it's taken firm positions in both spaces. It's done so in Gaza, on Ukraine. The G7 has been active and vocal throughout this period of significant change, and I think that speaks to the group's commitments. Its statements, of course, are not solutions. They are just statements, but they do matter. They do set the tone. They set the political tone. It's then incumbent on all of us, individually and collectively, to back that tone and those expectations with coordinated action, with coordinated humanitarian diplomacy, to press for results and press for accountability. But I think when we look at the G7 and the European Union and everybody who's trying their best to engage in this form of collective humanitarian diplomacy, collective advocacy, we recognize that it's not easy. Consensus-based approaches require dialogue, they require engagement, they require compromise, but they are worth it. They carry more weight when we speak together, when we speak with one voice. And we need to make sure that this collective approach to diplomacy doesn't tend towards the lowest common denominator, but rather pushes us all forward to be more forceful, more demanding in our diplomacy. The G7 is one group, but it is not alone. The G7 has partnered with others as well, has expanded the tent in its engagement, whether it's political public statements, but also in its humanitarian diplomacy. We've engaged in different formats with the different cross-cutting set of countries, recognizing, as Jan pointed out, that we need to talk to everybody and we need to bring people on board who have a different voice, who have a different access, and who have more of an ability to convince and influence those that we're trying to get behavior changes from. So the G7 is one group. We'll work with it. We'll work with others. I applaud all of the work that the EU is doing to bring the voices together through this forum and in other contexts to convene and to make sure that we can all, as an international community, speak with one voice.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Matthew. So I think you made an extremely important point that statements are key, but they're not enough. So I think it's how do we then translate those statements into concrete action on the ground, and also the importance of dialogue and basically long-term perseverance when it comes to having collaborative approaches around humanitarian diplomacy. So very back to you as a member of the parliament, so with everything we've heard, what do you hope to achieve or focus on over the coming few months when it comes to humanitarian diplomacy efforts? What will be your recommendation for your peers?
I
think it's the framing of the narrative. I mean, we've lost the argument so that now you can reduce aid and it comes with zero political cost electorally for leadership. And that is true across the EU, the United States, UK, and we've seen dramatic cuts and there's been no pushback. You know, I was in the Irish Parliament 20 years ago and we got incessant emails demanding that Ireland would go to 0.7. There was a party history campaign, ground up civic organisations. Now, all of these horrendous changes that are costing lives to people across the world are coming with no protest whatsoever. So it forces us then to have a proper conversation with ourselves. Why has this happened? Why did we lose the narrative? And how do we get it back, frankly? Because let's be, we're here because we're passionate about these things. And so I think the framing of the narrative is the crucial part of this. It's not enough anymore to say it's the right thing to do. It's not enough to do that. You have to be able to demonstrate some secondary consequences of not doing it. And so, in the Parliament, there is a massive pushback against aid, against foreign assistance, against multilateralism, against gender interventions, women's empowerment. All of this stuff is now kryptonite for a huge part, and even a majority in the Parliament. So we have to reframe it. I mean, we've got to stop being naive and hoping that our passion and our sense of right and wrong is enough to persuade populations. That has got us to where we are right now. So politically, that's a massive challenge. And I feel that all of us, I said this earlier, are looking through a keyhole, and there's nobody that has a global picture of what's happening. The humanitarian community have to recognise that without proper development funding, their challenges become just too great to manage. It just becomes irrelevant. So we have to stick together. So there needs to be leadership. There needs to be very clear leadership at this point. It has to be emotional. It has to be, as somebody said earlier on, humanizing, but it also has to be evidence-based. And we received two really crucial papers in the last couple of days. One demonstrating that for every euro of EU aid, it was $1 actually, of EU aid, we increase our exports by $1. So making the financial case. And EU, we also got a paper based on a literature review that demonstrates that EU aid works, that it has achieved the human development indicators that we're ambitious about. So evidence, emotion, and leadership, and reframing the agenda in that way.
Thank you. Thank you, Mary. I think here you are really giving us a solid picture also of the political reality and a wake-up call, as you say, saying, it's not enough to use our usual principles, rely on our value of humanity, but what is behind it, and the importance to really reframe the narrative and not just rely on traditional, I would say, narrative we've been using those last few years while we are being very much questioned. So, and here I think I want to come back to Ramesh. What do you say about that? Because, when we have a member of the European Parliament saying we lost the narrative, what is the role here you see also for humanitarians to influence, to be the voice of communities and bring that evidence base to also rebuild the trust and make humanitarian issues a political priority again? What would be your recommendations?
Thanks so much.
Mike.
Yes, I think we have said that this humanitarian reset is going to be based centered on people, and how do we have a devolving of power to local actors through local leadership in the situations that we face. So if you were to go and ask a community that has been under fire, as in Gaza, Syria, in Darfur, for example, what do they want? And not just restricted to what their humanitarian needs or what they feel they need to survive. What do they really want? What do they want for their children? And get a bit of a long-term view of this. Humanitarians are the only ones there who can ask those questions. You don't necessarily see the political actors or the development actors in those environments. So I think we need to be that messenger for the people in terms of what they need. If you ask someone in Gaza what they want, they'll clearly tell you what they want, politically, development-wise, and humanitarian-wise. So we need to take those messages, and that should be the basis of humanitarian diplomacy, because if you want to be people-centered, I think you would need to ask the mothers, the children, the fathers, who've been displaced, who've bombed out of their homes, what would they want to see in 5 years' time, and then build upon that so that we have a strong voice there. We do have privileged access to the EU through the UN, to the Security Council. How do we use that? And that's our responsibility, not just to be the voice for humanitarian needs, but to be that strong advocate. And it takes courage. I think just to, I think going back to what Jan said about, you need to learn to challenge and criticize your friends when they breach these principles. What does it actually mean? What does soft power mean? If you use soft power, for example, against, Jan mentioned before, the Assad government in Damascus for besieging areas, what does that mean? Can you also use that same soft power, let's say, for example, in Gaza, or in other situations, for example, in Sudan? And how do you hold to account everyone who does it? Because the moment the EU does this, and we've all seen the EU and Europe as a leader in terms of member states and diplomacy in the principal field. So to regain that thing, I think it really is to work in a consistent manner with all your principles that we have espoused, that you've inspired the world, in fact, also to espouse. So I think that's the key role for the EU, to take that leadership role. There's a gap now, to grab that role and to play, because I think that will also bring others on board as well. Thanks very much.
Thank you. So, dear audience, now we will turn to you. We will take a couple of questions. I will start with our colleagues who have been using Slido, and then of course I will come to the room. But let me kick off with 2 questions already that we have here, so our panelists can think about it. The first one is, do you have some recent examples where humanitarian diplomacy has actually worked, and what can we learn from it? Question number 1, I'll let you think about it and let me know who wants to take it. And the second one is again towards the EU. Jan Egeland said that we need to name who is blocking aid and who is supporting those that are blocking it. The EU has been vocal against suspension of humanitarian access to Gaza, but Israeli statements and words seem to change nothing. What should the EU do more, or what should the EU do better? Who would like to come? And then I'll turn to you.
I don't mind.
Please.
Alphabetically, I'll start. So, I think just on the example, the one that comes to mind is the Black Sea Grain Initiative, which was, I think, Martin Griffiths had a lot to do with that. And from my recollection, it was the humanitarian imperative allowed both sides to do the right thing, because there were parts of Africa which were very dependent on those exports, and so it gave the cover, and I think it's a good example of how humanitarian diplomacy can work very well and create that sort of low-hanging fruit to bring parties to a conflict together. Of course, it hasn't had any long-term benefit, but look, what more can the EU do? I mean, in Parliament at the moment, we are working on lots of different initiatives. One of the things is to obtain a legal opinion to demonstrate the positive obligations created for the Commission by the ICJ ruling, particularly in terms of trade and EU-Israel trade agreement. So we're working on that, and we hope that will have create a dynamic and momentum, and it's incredibly frustrating, of course. We have another plenary in Brussels on Wednesday and Thursday, another debate on Wednesday. Parliament will take its sides one way or the other, but you just have to keep going with these initiatives. So.
Thank you, Barry. Anyone else? Yeah, if you want to come.
An example, I think that was positive of diplomacy, which I could witness myself, was in Goma. Now, how many? 4 weeks ago, we came there. There are now 1.8 million people have returned in the area that M23 holds. It happened to some extent at gunpoint, which is not a voluntary or good way to bring people home, but they were able to go home to their ancestral land. However, 18,000 still in Goma city when we came, and they were in horrible conditions because they fled into town. It was too far for them to return home. And they had, the day before we came, talk by M23, this rebel movement, we're coming tomorrow for you, and the men will be interned, and the women and the children the men will go to forced labor, the women will be interned in the football stadium with their children. So that night we were able to meet the M23 leaders and said, you do that, we will expose you to the world. It will look very bad for you. And by the way, it will be look bad for Rwanda. Then we said, but we can help those who will return home voluntarily. We can help them home in a voluntary manner. And they went back and had sessions and said, okay, voluntary is better than forced. You can do it. I mean, in many cases, it's basic to have built relations with acceptance over some time with this group. We've built relations now for 10 years with them. We know them, they know us. We have built that kind of relationship. I could speak on what more EU should be doing on Gaza, but maybe others want to.
Yeah, thank you.
Step in first.
Yeah, thanks. So a couple of points, examples that come to my mind. When the cross-border operation from Turkey to Syria through the Security Council resolutions failed and Russia vetoed it, it was through humanitarian diplomacy, a lot of work with Damascus that the previous USG Martin Griffiths led, and he actually managed to get the Damascus regime at that time to open up the border, and they're still open for transit from Turkey to Syria without going through at that point the Damascus authorities. So that continues. So I think that was a good example of engagement. I think you cannot have humanitarian diplomacy if you don't have engagement. Even with perhaps the most sinister actors, it's important to have that engagement and not isolate them, because the more you isolate them, the less access you have to them. So that's super important. Another thing I'd like to refer to is perhaps to take Jan back 20 years to, he led the discussions with the LRA, the Lord's Resistance Army, when he was in South Sudan. No one else was speaking to them, even the political actors from the UN were not speaking to them. However, he took it upon himself because obviously that would then have an enormous impact on the community children, and that problem was eventually brought to an end through that dialogue. So I think humanities do have access to people. We have to remain engaged. But at the same time, our neutrality is super important. So, and again, it comes back to member states and donors. That neutrality can only be maintained if we have that common, consistent approach to principles the globe over. Whenever these principles are breached, there's the same reaction to them. And then one last thing, I think it's important to say that it takes courage to be principled. But at the same time, I think we should be inspired by people like Asma, etc., who's probably got courage in balance with very little hope. So I think in those cases, we really need to look at, go back again to the people who are affected, the ones who are harmed, and ask them, listen to them, what would they want us to do, and take their action. Thank you.
Thank you.
Merci. Maybe my example is a bit less conventional, but I think it's also illustrative of how humanitarian diplomacy, how it's very multifaceted. So far from the dangerous environments of Goma or Sudan, the example I would turn to is after the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan, there was a recognition in Canada that a criminal code and the counterterrorism legislation that we have within it would create real barriers to organizations trying to deliver assistance. This goes beyond sanctions, it was really Canada's domestic criminal legislation. So there was a desire and